Welcome, friends, to our foray into philosophy of religion. This one is called Decoding Aquinas, and it is about the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, a friar from the 13th century. So let's begin with just a fact sheet on Mr. Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. There are the days when he was around. And notably, he was a Dominican friar. The reason why I think this is interesting and important is because the Dominican order was specifically designed or created to combat the existing heresies of the day. So heresies are ideas that are not sanctioned by the Catholic Church. And so this, the very goal of this order of friars was to go out into the community and get rid of these views, the views that were still around in some Christian circles that were not what the official teaching of the Catholic Church was. So that is the occupation of St. Thomas Aquinas. And of course, part of the way he would do that is he would make philosophical works that clarify the teachings of the Catholic Church. So we are looking today at one of his notable accomplishments, the 5 ways. He also came up with some views about how it is that war is justified. We won't look at those in this class. In fact, we won't even look at all of the 5 ways. We are only going to look at one of the 5 ways. So let's get going with that. To understand Mr. Thomas Aquinas. I keep calling him Mr. I'm not sure why. To understand him, you should sort of get a feel for what was going on at the time period. During Aquinas' lifetime, the theory of double truth was taking root. The view that philosophy and religion should pursue truth independently of each other, in spite of apparent conflicts in what they might find. So it was becoming evident to some people that if you were to just do philosophy, if you were to just try to reason and think about the world and try to discover how it works and what truth is, it might take you to a different place than what the church is officially saying is the truth. In other words, theology and philosophy seem to be diverging. Now, this is in large part because during this time period, lots of philosophical works from the classical period, right from ancient Greece, were being rediscovered by the West. And so with these new ideas being reinserted into the intellectual life of Western Europe, there was bound to be a little bit of conflict. And so some people were just taking a hands-off approach and saying, well, let everyone pursue truth in the way that they want to. If you want to do philosophy, that's cool. If you want to do theology, that's cool too. Aquinas did not like that one bit. He rejected double truth, arguing instead that reason and faith ought to take everyone to the same conclusions. That is, theology and philosophy are different methods of discovering the same underlying truth. It might seem like there's multiple paths, as you can kind of guess that people were thinking, oh, it goes in different directions. But no, really, they end up in the same place. It's actually only one path. It seems like 2, but it's really all taking you to the same place. Okay, well, that's Aquinas' rejection of double truth. But double truth was actually replacing another existing view, a view that was endorsed by individuals like St. Anselm here in the picture. This is the view of scholasticism, and basically that's the view that reason ought to be used specifically to defend the Christian faith. On this view, philosophy is sort of subservient to theology. You use philosophy insofar as it can help you defend the faith. And again, Aquinas didn't like that at all, right? Aquinas thought you don't need to make philosophy subservient to the faith. They already take you to the same destination, right? The same kind of truth. So he also rejected this way of thinking, and in so doing, created a sort of new theological movement, in the very least popularized a new theological movement, even if it wasn't original to him. And we now refer to this as natural theology. This is a type of inquiry into the nature of God, or just into theology in general, that seeks to establish the existence of a supernatural deity, right, of God, by pointing to some natural phenomenon which purportedly cannot be explained absent the existence of a supernatural deity. So, two things I should say here, and I'll do so with the aid of a quote in a second, but what's going on here is what's truly visible here is the influence of the ancient Greek philosophy that was being rediscovered by Western Europe. So this idea that you have to look at the natural world to really understand things, well, that's a very Aristotelian idea. That is a very Aristotle-like way of looking at the world. And Aristotle, although he was around and read widely in the Muslim world, had not really been that readily available in Western Europe. So as the Arabic texts were being translated to Latin so that St. Thomas Aquinas can get his hands on them, these ideas were kind of percolating in his mind. That's one thing we should note. And so with that, I'll mention the second thing in a bit, but let's begin to look at this quote so you can kind of get a feel for the intellectual atmosphere of the time. The middle years of the 13th century, when St. Thomas Aquinas was developing a system, marked the height of the attempt to harmonize faith and reason, where previously the traditional outlook, represented by the Augustinians, had regarded all true knowledge as the result of God illuminating the soul. Aquinas made all human knowledge begin with sense perception. St. Thomas's system was the culmination of the effort to fuse the natural and the supernatural into a comprehensive outlook, in which one was complementary to the other. The second thing I wanted to emphasize is right there in that last sentence. It's about complementarity. You're not doing two different things. Theology and philosophy ought to take you to the same place. God so made the world that discovering more about the world will lead you to, in a way, reinforcing your faith. So that is a nice little synopsis of sort of the background assumptions of St. Thomas Aquinas. Okay, without further ado, let's look at the second way. This is typically called the argument from efficient causes, and as a reminder, it's one of 5 arguments that Aquinas gives for God's existence. I guess here's another reminder. He didn't come up with these, right? He is finding them in the literature and sort of explaining them and making some clarifications there with the aim of teaching other friars how to combat heresy. That's basically the idea here. So, okay, let's begin to look at this argument. Every existing thing has a cause. Okay, that makes sense, right? Everything you see around you was caused by something. Hence, every cause itself has a cause, right? So we are caused by something, and we cause other things in turn, and the things that caused us were themselves caused by things. There's basically a sense in which there is just an infinite. Let's pause on what infinite might mean here in a second, but there's a chain of causation, a very long chain of causation. And as you can just tell, take the example of, let's start with me. Why not? I was caused by my parents, and my parents were caused by my grandparents, and my grandparents were caused in turn by my great-grandparents, and up the chain, great-great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents. You get the gist, right? There seems to be a long chain of causation. And of course, in order for me, which is the last effect in that chain of causation, to exist, the cause must exist, the cause of the entire chain. Therefore, if the first cause in a series of causes doesn't exist, then nothing exists. That's another way of saying, if you just think about the cause that is, or the first cause that could be found to be my lineage, my genetic lineage, if you find the first people that began to make my great family members, right? If you get rid of them, if you go back in a time machine and find the very first people that began my lineage, well, then you don't get me. You don't get any of that long chain of causation. That's all that this first sub-conclusion is saying. Basically, you can wipe out an entire chain of being if you get rid of the first item in that chain of being. Well, things do exist, and now let's broaden our perspective to realize, well, I guess everything ultimately is part of a big chain of causation. All human life could be said to have begun with, some primordial soup, however it happened. I guess scientists aren't sure, but if that first living cell didn't ever exist, well, then you don't get any of us. And the same could be said for the planet and the universe in general. It had to have one initial cause. Things obviously do exist, and there must be then some uncaused first cause. You need something to be there to set off everything else in motion, to sustain everything else, this whole chain of being, to keep it in place, so to speak. So that is the basic argument. Now, I like to clarify this by essentially telling you how not to interpret it and then interpreting it correctly. So the examples that I gave, I admit are a little problematic, and it's just because it's hard to understand this in any other way from our vantage point. But some of the examples that I gave, like me being born through a chain of causes, my parents, my grandparents, that makes you think of causation in a sort of linear way, right? A temporal way, across time, so to speak. And that is totally wrong. So I sort of deliberately misled you, but it's to make a good point. So let me make that point for you now. Some people first hear this argument and they think, okay, well, there's a chain of causation where like you get A, then B, then C, then D, something like that. Well, that's not what Aquinas was thinking, and let's look at objections to that view to convince you that that's also how not to think about it in your case. You should also not think about that argument in that way in your case. So here is someone that is hungover, and it's very natural for us to think in causal terms, right? So what caused that? Well, right before you're hungover, you're very drunk, like this gentleman right here. And so what causes someone to be very drunk? Well, obviously drinking a lot. This, my friends, is a bad idea. That is not what you want to do on your Saturday nights, because then the pictures on the right will be how you spend your Sunday mornings and afternoons. In any case, if you take this sort of linear interpretation of this argument, you basically reinterpret this whole chain of being so that literally everything is caused by God, right? That God sets everything in motion. And I think I even said that when I was explaining the argument. Well, that is an interpretation. It just happens to be not what Aquinas meant. And this is a problematic interpretation, not only because that's not what Aquinas meant, but also because there's good objections to this interpretation. And hopefully you like them. If sound, this argument, under this interpretation, would only establish the existence of some mysterious first cause, but it does not establish the present existence of the first cause. For all we know, this first cause no longer exists. So I have here a picture of a praying mantis because famously, I don't know if it's famous or not, but I do know that praying mantises, when they lay their eggs, die soon after. So the praying mantis is the cause of the eggs, but it doesn't mean it currently exists, right? So how do we know that God didn't set everything in motion and then just died or stopped existing for whatever reason, right? So this argument under the linear interpretation that we're playing with right now, it doesn't seem to prove that God exists right now. And that seems to be a problem for the Christian worldview. I hope you can see. So if we go back to our example of the drunken beer binge, well, one thing that we know about the cause of this whole chain of causation is that beer, my friends, that beer that began this entire chain of unfortunate events is gone. That's exactly what happens to get drunk. You drink all of that beer. So same thing with God. How do we know God is still around? It seems like under this interpretation, we have no way of knowing that God is still around. Okay, how about this objection? If everything has a cause, then God must have a cause too. In other words, premise 1 and the conclusion contradict each other. The argument is invalid. Well, here is the argument reproduced for you. And let me go ahead and just block out everything here, except the first premise and the conclusion. Take a look. Doesn't look good, right? It looks like a direct contradiction. How can this argument possibly be valid? All right, that's a serious objection. One more. One could also hold the brute fact view, the view that the universe simply exists and requires no explanation. Those who endorse this view reject premise 1. So this is basically saying, I won't even let you have premise 1 in your argument. I object immediately to this argument. Maybe the universe is just one of those things, right? If you ever watch that documentary series Cosmos, I think I'm going to paraphrase here, but it begins with the cosmos is all there is, all there was, all there ever will be. So on this view, you don't really explain the universe. It just is the thing that we're in, the thing under which explanations work, right? So you don't explain the universe itself, you explain things within the universe. Well, there it is. Those are pretty serious objections, and I hope you can see that maybe that linear interpretation is not the way you want to go. Let's look at the correct hierarchical interpretation. So Aquinas was reading a bunch of Aristotle, as we just discussed, and was greatly influenced by Aristotle, as was basically every intellectual during this time period. And for that reason, he understood causation in a hierarchical sense, in an Aristotelian sense, right? So a lot of us today, we just understand causation differently. We just see causation in sort of the way Newton thought about it, where like you see a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, and a kinetic movement gets transferred over, et cetera, right? That's just how we think about it. You think of modern physics when you think about causation. That is totally not how Aristotle saw the world. So, since Aquinas was an Aristotelian, when Aquinas argued that there must be a first cause, he meant that there must exist a being which sustains all other causal activity. Pause on that for a second. What does that mean? Well, one way of explaining this is as follows. Maybe you can explain everything in our universe through things like gravity, strong and weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, right? Those things will help you explain everything. What Aquinas was saying is that something must keep those things working the way that they do. Something keeps electromagnetism functioning as it does. Something keeps strong and weak nuclear forces working the way that they do, right? That's the idea that Aquinas is pushing. Some being keeps all other laws of nature in place. It's almost like It's that image of a man spinning all these plates on his hands and feet, Someone's got to keep all those plates spinning, and that would be God, right? All the laws of nature are sustained by God. Well, let me give you another analogy. Hopefully this one's more to your liking, but let's talk about one of my favorite games, Pac-Man. Why not? Coincidentally, you can jump online and get the source code for this game and mess around with it. It's a good time if you're into coding. So let's just say we are one of the little ghosts or Pac-Man or whatever in this game, and we ask ourselves, what really is keeping our game world in place? Well, that's code, right? The code is sort of what keeps the game in place. If we keep pushing, we'll say, well, what keeps the code in place? Well, I don't know. Memory on the computer, it might tell some story about microprocessors and such. Okay, well, what keeps those working, right? Well, I guess human minds made them, right? So human minds sustain all the computing power that is necessary to run the code, to run the game. And if you keep going with this idea, okay, what allows human minds to continue to exist? Well, then you get back to the story of, the laws of nature, strong and weak nuclear forces and gravity and yada, yada, yada. Okay, well, what keeps all of those things in place? Well, now you're getting it. It seems like if we go all the way down to our level of existence, right? We're in the game. And if we keep pushing back and figure out what allows our system, our game to exist the way it does, eventually you're going to have to get to a first cause, something that keeps everything else functioning. And what Aquinas was saying is that first cause is God. God keeps all the other causal powers in place. Gravity, strong and weak nuclear forces, whatever. God is the one who maintains all those causal relationships in place.